Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming and welcome to the final session in the Talking About Contemporary Art lecture series hosted by Dr. Mark Pennings and in conjunction with the spectacular 21st Century Art in the First Decade exhibition here at the Gallery of Modern Art. Also welcome to those of you who are joining us online via our live webcast at the 21st Century blog. Following the first 4 lectures in the series, each session now features an in conversation with one or two of the exhibition's curatorial staff, looking at key areas explored in the exhibition. Today, Mark is joined by Russell Storer, Curatorial Manager, Asian and Pacific Art, and Nicholas Chambers, Curator of Contemporary International Art, here at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. As we will be recording today's session, if you have any questions, I'll ask that you please come down and speak with Mark, Russell and Nick at the end. And can I also please request that any mobile phones please be turned to silent. If you miss anything from today's session, or if you would like to view any other sessions from the series, you can log on and view them at the 21st Century blog website, 21cblog.com, or on the Gallery's YouTube channel. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers today.
Thank you very much for turning up today. We've had really good attendance at the lecture series and interviews, so thank you so much. And also, of course, it's a great opportunity to find out more about the 21st Century show and also the kind of knowledge that Russell and Nicholas have. As Fiona said, of course, both of them are heavily invested in contemporary art as curators, and with that, of course, is an attention to the kind of movements or interests or themes that have appeared in contemporary art and continue to appear. In the case of Russell, I mean, both Nicholas and Russell are originally from Sydney, and Russell he worked at the Rosalind Oxley Gallery in Sydney, which is, many of you know, a highly regarded contemporary space. He was also curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, another very well regarded space. Nicholas as well, he did his BA in Art History and Theory at the University of Sydney, and has also been a fellow at the Yale University of British Art. At one point he got a stint there, which again I think is a really wonderful achievement. So after sort of preparing the ground with telling you what these guys have achieved, and that's just a small part of that, I wanted to get straight into the first question, which is really trying to focus a lot on what were the motivations behind the 21st Century show, and what are some of the concerns that these guys had. So the first question to both of you is, why was the curatorial topic, why was 21st Century art selected? And how did the museum's collection fit into that kind of idea?
Sure. Shall I start on that? So maybe to sort of take a couple of steps back from the question, I mean, the gallery has a kind of rotating program of, in terms of our big summer exhibitions here at GOMA. So we have 3 curatorial departments, and each summer this show that occupies the entire GOMA building kind of rotates. So of course the APT happened last summer, and there was a big contemporary Australian exhibition the summer before that. So this year I work in the International Art Department. It was our turn, as it were, to kind of lead the development of the exhibition. And I guess the first idea really came from Tony Elwood, our director, and we were having sort of some quite open discussions about what kind of form we'd like this exhibition to take. And one thing we discussed early on was that it wouldn't just look at the particular collection area that I work on, but something that could be quite expansive in terms of the different geographic areas that the exhibition was looking at. And I think Tony also mentioned early on he was quite interested in the date of the exhibition. So the exhibition, of course, is taking place over the summer of 2010, 2011. So there was this, kind of in a way, it was marking the end of the first decade of the 21st century. And so that was just sort of an early idea that was put out there that we just started to have a range of different discussions about, in terms of how do we approach putting together a show that in different ways is perhaps reflecting on the last decade of art practice, or I think in another way thinking about the way that museum practice has changed, the way that our own practice as museum professionals has changed over that period. And we looked at a range of different ideas, some of which included working just on large-scale commissions that we'd bring in from artists based overseas. We also looked at other exhibition models that were largely based around borrowing works from other institutions overseas. But one thing that we did as kind of part of the process for thinking about this show is that we did this very simple thing of simply doing a search of our collection database, where we just did a search that would bring up every single piece that we had in our permanent collection that was executed between 2000 and 2010, just to see what that looked like. And that was a really fantastic thing to do, because it became really apparent to us that our own collection was really quite deep and very interesting over that period. And one of the reasons for that was that this first decade of the 21st century has also been a period of really extraordinary growth for us as an institution. So this building opened in November 2006, with APT that year. And I guess in a way the first half of the 21st century was spent developing this building in terms of the physical shape that it's taken. But it was also spent developing exhibition programs and also our collection towards this new standalone building just for contemporary art. So that period, that first 10 years, there was a sort of very interesting story that was very much about us. So those were some of the thoughts that were kind of circulating around. And in the end, we thought that maybe the most interesting thing for us to do would be to make an exhibition looking at the last decade, but specifically through the lens of our own collection. And so in saying that, we were quite mindful of the exhibition, not attempting to present this kind of encyclopedic, take on the last 10 years of practice, nor were we trying to make some kind of series of definitive statements about what had taken place. But it's very much, it was a story that was as much about the art practice over that period as it was about the tastes of a whole range of curators that have worked here at the institution, and 2 different directors that have been here over the last decade.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Nicholas, sorry to interrupt, but in saying that about the first 10 years, I'm just saying, you weren't trying to make any definitive statement, but clearly, well, I would think that, obviously when it got to 2010, 11, there were some observations that could be made. There were some kind of, I suppose, some summaries, no matter how, not general at all, but sort of how broadly thematic they may have been. Was that the case when the director sort of said, let's try and do this? I mean, or did that come apparent when you actually started looking through,
Look, I think it's a bit of a combination of both. So I think certainly when, if we think in a kind of broad and slightly abstract way about art of the last decade, that I think there are certain, themes and, approaches to making work that do kind of occur to us as having been a real force, I guess, in the last decade of practice. So, there was that, and we were all aware of what those things might be. But at the end of the day, we had to return to what was there. We had to return to actually what was in our collection. So, I guess both were playing into it. Obviously we haven't included every single object in our collection, over that date range. So, selections were made, and we did decide to illustrate some things rather than others. But, it was very much, I'd say in the most part, it was a process of responding to what was there, what the kind of fact, in a way, of the collection was.
And Russell, from your perspective, a response to that sort of, the topic of 21st century meant to you initially?
Yep. I wasn't directly involved in the curatorial development of the show, but obviously involved in certain points, coming from the Asian and Pacific department. And I think for me what was interesting is it reflects a sense of, I guess, critical mass that's happened in the institution and the collections, something that the APT has driven to a large extent for nearly 20 years now, to really acquire very actively in a particular area, and obviously over and above the Australian collections, which has always been a strength, as a way of thinking about our place internationally or at least regionally. And that's built a certain level of a collection, a certain depth, where certain stories can start to be told, I think. And I think that's really reflected in this. Like, there is such a depth and diversity in the collection now, and that can be built in new areas, and that started happening over the last few years into the Middle East or Latin America or whatever. So I think that initial push has sort of expanded out in a sense that can be really built upon. And I was just thinking too, it's a great follow-on from the APT, which is a spatial kind of show in a sense. It's about geography, whereas this is a temporal show. It's about time. So it kind of, which are both very important aspects of the contemporary, I think, and the way we think about contemporary art is very much about where we are in space and time. It's about context. It's about being in the moment. It's about our relationship to other spaces and times, which are all operating at the, contemporaneously, I guess you could say. So I think it's a wonderful, something we couldn't have done 10 years ago, but we could certainly do now.
But given the gallery's investment in Asia-Pacific art, as you said, the APTs are very important. Did you feel particularly, well placed with the Australia-Pacific collection that the museum had to really,
Yeah.
that a lot of the stuff was in the collection to start with?
Yeah. I mean, I think that this gallery has been really at the forefront of collecting art from Asia and the Pacific internationally. So it has some very signature works, looking at very key artists who've made a big impact on our notion of contemporary art over the last 10 years. Because I think one other thing that's happened certainly since the 90s is this much broader kind of global idea of art, and contemporary art coming out of a much wider field than it had before, with the sort of modernist kind of history. So I think we were extremely well placed in a sense to really map a contemporary of the last 10 years from this part of the world. So it's a very different look at the decade to what you might get from a museum in London or New York, I think. Yeah.
And Nicholas, in relation to, you said you worked through the collection. Collection's very strong, and Russell's just said how strong it was for the Asia-Pacific. But clearly there must have been certain gaps for you, like you must have, once you were looking at what there was in the collection, you must have thought, that must have actually spurred you on to think about the works you didn't have and that you needed to complete certain the thematics, I suppose, for want of a better word.
Yeah, and I think for us that operated most successfully in terms of developing new commissions for the show. So, a big exhibition like this really provides us with the kind of opportunity to develop, some new projects. I mean, literally because of the scale of the show. So, I mean, one new area of collection development that we just started to build over the last, really very recently, maybe over the last 12 to maybe 24 months, has been contemporary African art. So this is something that, there's a few kind of isolated examples in the collection, but we had never kind of looked at it in a concerted way, and it's now, part of our collection development policy. So it's kind of identified as something that we will continue to develop. So, there are certain things like that I think during the development of the show, we could see that, this was something that, I think something like Africa we saw that as something that not only were we not doing in a serious way, but probably not any other art museum in Australia was really kind of, trying to focus on. So, with that in mind, that, the exhibition did present an opportunity to develop some new commissions that could be, really quite sort of major investments into artists from that region. So, for instance, Pascal Martin Taillou, I don't know if we've got a slide actually. Well, maybe we'll come to it. Here we go. Which is this piece here, which is on the ground floor here at Goma. So this very large piece that's made from these, plastic bags, is kind of very, pregnant, I think almost sort of threatening form hanging from the ceiling. So, that was a piece that we didn't acquire. It hasn't gone into our collection after the show, but we, worked with the artist for a period of about 6 months to kind of develop this up as a project for the exhibition.
I was just thinking it looks a little bit like a wasp nest. When you say
Huh,
it,
yeah.
it looks a bit ominous. So you had no problems with the commissions, like with the artist that you thought you needed and the work you needed was fine. All artists were more than happy to.
Yeah, no, look, absolutely. I think as Russell touched on, that, this gallery does present a really kind of interesting context for many artists internationally, because our collection has quite a different point of emphasis that's developed largely through the APT. So I think, for many artists that are quite seasoned in working, through Europe and the United States, this institution presents, on the one hand, I think it presents a very different audience who are very familiar and I think knowledgeable in quite a sophisticated way about contemporary art, quite globally, which is, possibly less the case in certain parts of North America and Europe. So, the most part artists, were very happy to work with us. And, even some very established artists like Carsten Höller, who, someone we trained to work with for quite a number of years. And this exhibition was really the kind of opportunity to move that forward.
Many of you know that Höller is the slide work. But might I ask, Nick, with this Teiu, why did you want this work? Is it because Teiu is one of the better quality practitioners out of Africa at the moment? Were there other things that you were working on that particularly interested you?
Look, I think there are a couple of things. On the one hand, it related to kind of a thematic idea that we were developing for the show, which, I can talk about that now. I think we're going to...
Yeah, that'd be great, because I was wondering about that. How did you identify the themes? How did that all come about? It obviously came out over a period of time. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess we thought about them less as, I think we have a slide actually that, here we go. That was thinking about them less as themes in a conventional sense, or in a sense of wanting to, kind of delimit and frame exactly the way that you would approach a certain group of works, and more to think of them as ideas. So we had quite a large group of curators working on the show, and just through kind of ongoing discussions that we had about the exhibition, about the collection, these were some of the ideas that came out. And sometimes they do relate to a very specific, pod of works, if you like, that you might encounter in the exhibition. But other times we wanted to more introduce them as an idea that could stay with you as you went through the show. So things that were kind of connecting, across different locations in the museum. But there were also, I guess, particular stories that we had in mind in terms of the journey through the exhibition. And certainly one thing that we were thinking about, especially with putting that work like the Carsten Höller in the foyer, and some of these works that did have, I think, rather kind of extraordinary fabrication kind of budgets involved in putting them together, one might say, is that, we were kind of looking at, the fact that at the beginning, I think, of the 21st century, the art market did grow in quite a phenomenal way, which did, I think, really enable a certain, group of artists who were, it was maybe a relatively small number, but a very visible group of artists who were able to, work on this very, very ambitious scale. And certainly, exhibition spaces like the Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern and, other spaces of this kind of grandeur did support those kinds of projects. And they became some of the, I think, most visible projects internationally over the last decade. So, that was something that we wanted to talk about. But actually the first piece that one enters, oops, where did that go? Enters the exhibition through is this work here, which is a piece by Zhu Zhen, which was included in, I think, the APT before.
The China project.
In the China project, yeah. And it was actually a piece that Zhu Zhen had made for his dealer's art fair booth at the Basel Art Fair in, I guess, 2007. So, the Basel Art Fair being, possibly the kind of preeminent marketplace for contemporary art internationally. And, this was kind of, I guess, at the height of a rather inflated art market that he exhibited this piece. And, so rather than, kind of display, paintings or sculptures or the kind of conventional things that one would encounter in an art fair booth, he literally transformed the booth into a convenience store. So it was his kind of way of commenting upon this very kind of inflated state that the art market had reached.
So obviously it's installation practice, but one of his statements was that global art was a kind of supermarket. Was that the point that this year it's Afghanistan, artists from Afghanistan that getting the sales, and next year it's someone from Iraq or something?
Yeah, and certainly making it for an art fair that is the ultimate art supermarket really, and galleries from all around the world sort of vie to have their booth and pay thousands of dollars to have this little tiny space, which is really where everyone comes together. I mean, the other aspect of this work is that all the packages are empty. So it's a quite sort of sharp little jab at that as well.
Yeah, it certainly gives resonance to the idea of inflated, doesn't it? So, but also when I did discuss, I did chat briefly with Nick during the week about this, I also wanted to ask you too about specific themes. And in the case of you, Nick, I was going to ask you about the new art povera or the new art pavera. I'm not really sure what that means. And Russell about global ideas about contemporary urbanism. So Nick, is that new art pavera been a particular interest for you?
Look, I think it was something that, you know, I certainly reflected on in my piece for the exhibition catalogue, and it's something that we did want to, you know, bring to the fore in the very first space that you enter after coming through the supermarket. And I think the new, you know, art povera is sort of one way of thinking about it. Art povera being, you know, a kind of associated group of artists working in Europe, many of them in Italy in the 1970s. So we're working with, you know, very kind of, you know, impoverished, if you like, sort of at hand, you know, I guess non-fine art, one could say, materials in their work. And so I guess one thing that was interesting for me in sort of thinking about whether or not that kind of approach to art making has returned was, you know, looking at that phenomenon of this kind of, you know, boom to bust cycle that the art market went through over the course of the last decade. And while there were artists, you know, on a Carsten Höller level, you know, working with these very kind of, you know, ambitious works in terms of scale and budget, you know, etc., that there were artists who were working on the flip side of that, you know, who were, you know, often also producing very kind of monumental pieces, but working with very accessible materials, you know, materials that are kind of at hand, if you like. So, I mean, there's a piece here that is by Tobias Putri, who's a young artist from Slovenia, which is this, you know, gigantic archway that is actually, it's an adaptable piece, so we can, you know, add or remove elements to the kind of curvature of the arch to install it in different gallery spaces. And I mean, the actual form of it is based on a very kind of famous public sculpture by the Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen. It's the Gateway Arch in St. Louis in the United States, which is this, you know, this kind of rather heroic concrete form in a public space. So for Tobias, his work are often, I guess, constitutes these kind of, you know, slightly kind of ironic takes on these kind of, you know, monumental kind of examples from the history of 20th century art or design or architecture. And instead of, you know, presenting these things as these, you know, kind of completed and these sort of resolved forms, for him, I guess they're closer to the idea of a maquette, you know, something that's on the way somewhere else, you know, something that's an experiment in the studio and is never kind of completed, if you like.
The other thing that strikes me about the work is, I suppose, for want of a better word, its kind of democratic nature. And I'm talking about the materials. It's not made, it's not something that's had to get made in a foundry, which no one could, you know, no kind of normal person going to look at it would be able to manufacture. But here, you know, there were sort of everyday materials that, you know, you could go home and build your own putteries, should you so choose.
Yeah, and look, and I think, you know, there's a few works that might maybe fit into that category. I mean, this is another work by a young Moroccan artist, Latifa Ekchak, which is it's at the far end of Gallery 1.1 on the ground floor, and it's all made from sheets of carbon paper, which, you know, again, a very kind of cheap material, but, you know, which strangely was, well, maybe not so strangely, it was very hard to acquire. I mean, it's, you know, not something that's obviously used terribly regularly these days. So it was, when it came to actually putting this piece together, it was, you know, there was a lot of research involved in actually sourcing all of these materials. But
Did you get a lot of carbon paper?
well, actually, we had a really fantastic intern who was working with us, who sourced that material, who's in the audience. So perhaps we can ask her at the end. But yeah, I'm not too sure.
And Russell, the idea of global contemporary urbanism.
Oh, I'll use some pictures. Yeah, so I mean, I'll sort of use Gallery 1.3 as a reference. I mean, it's something that I touched on a bit before, is this idea of the how do you define the contemporary, you know, after a kind of linear history of modernism, you know, what does contemporary art mean? And it's a very contested area. There's a lot of discussion about what that term really means. Is it just art being made now? Is it art that has another element to it that defines it, as opposed to someone just making paintings, which, you know, come out of a modernist tradition, but just happen to be made this week? So it's, I think one of the aspects of it that's part of the thinking about it is that it is art that is aware, in a sense, of its time in relation to other times. So it's something that's very much in a dialogue with what's going on around it, you know, not only in terms of other art being made, you know, here or elsewhere, but also with history and also with its context, so where it's presented. So I think the Zhuzhen's a good example, you know, work that's pretty site specific. You know, it's made for an art fair and it's commenting on that particular site. But then obviously when it's brought in here, it starts to take on a different meaning. So artists are very aware, contemporary artists are very aware of that shift in meaning that happens when works are moved around. So in 1.3, there's a number of works that I think reflect on the time, and often contemporary art also reflects on history and reflects on modernist history and the sort of what happens at the end of modernism. And a lot of that, certainly in art coming out of, say, Africa or Asia or Latin America, it's to do with, you know, the end of colonialism, for example, and the kind of independence movements that came out of that, a certain kind of nationalism. So these works here by Guy Tillam, for example, are 6 from a larger series taken in sub-Saharan Africa. He's a South African photographer, but he's been documenting these spaces throughout Africa, sort of post-independence, and looking at the kind of, it's called the Avenue Patrice Lumumba, who was a Congolese independence fighter, sort of who was murdered by the Belgians. And so the kind of utopian, I guess, ideas of those independence activists and politicians have really fallen on their, you know, on their sword in a way, with, you know, terrible civil wars and, you know, really grievous situations all across the region. And here in these photographs, really recording the desolate end of that sort of idea.
Yes, I was thinking, when I was looking at that, you mentioned the end of colonialism. Of course, there's that term post-colonialism, which is very popular. But it struck me that sort of post-colonial idea because those buildings are built some time ago.
Yes.
Like they're entering into stage of decay, and that's what the legacy is.
That's right. That's what's sort of left behind. And the idea of, you know, modernism was a very utopian one. It was about making a better world, about better ways of living, better ways of like living with each other. You know, constructing these concrete sort of cities, really, that were supposed to be, you know, great ways to be, but obviously were, you know, really not so much at all. And, you know, do go into rot and decay. And then these amazing photographs of offices just full of paperwork. So this legacy of colonial bureaucracies that have completely stymied any sense of progress. And anyone who's been or tried to do work in a number of post-colonial countries will know how savage that bureaucracy can be, like trying to get through red tape just to get a phone line put on or to get any decisions made about something. On the wall there is a work by Superflex, which is a Danish collaborative, who've made this video called Flooded McDonald's, and looking at, I suppose, global consumer culture, which is another recurrent theme, I guess, in terms of using the idea of McDonald's, the kind of ultimate corporate international, you know, food chain, which has changed eating habits all over the world, and no matter where you go, you get the same thing. So it's this idea of the global, sort of generic global, I think. But in this work, it's very humorously, you know, restaged a McDonald's store and slowly filled it with water. So, you know, this in the style of a disaster movie, which is quite funny. But obviously referencing things like global warming or environmental destruction and so on. There's a number of works here that also use this idea of recycling that Nick mentioned. I think the Romuald Hazame masks here, I think, are a really very sort of pointed way of doing that. So using recycled materials, but really thinking about what those materials mean in that context of West Africa. Romuald's from Benin, and West Africa's been the source. I mean, a big industry has grown up around Europe, selling its rubbish to Africa as a dumping ground, basically. And he often also uses these plastic petrol cans that are used to sort of ferry illegal petrol across the border from Nigeria, which have become a black market. So by selling them back to the Western art market, in a sense, as mask forms, he's really making a pointed statement about sending the rubbish back, in a sense, to where it came from. But in this, I guess, the form of the African mask is maybe an exoticized way we think about African culture, but of course was hugely influential on modernist art, Picasso and so on. So there's a lot of layers to the materials that he uses.
And would you mind just going back one image, Russell? I just want to say there that when you're talking about it, it struck me at the real contrast between two kinds of global. As you said, the generic sort of clean global and then decaying global.
Yeah. And actually, one other relationship I think is very interesting. I don't have an image here, but behind that wall is that big painting by Nigel Cook, who's an English artist, and it's a big image of a decaying modernist, brutalist sort of city in England. So that's also another legacy of modernism that has. I mean, a lot of Western cities have had these bad legacies of that kind of architecture as well, where these ghettos sort of form in the inner cities, and it looks a pretty desolate place. And then here, a couple of photographic pieces. Beat Streuly, a Swiss artist who photographs cities around the world, and again, you get this sense of a kind of generic urbanism that happens. No matter where you go in the world, people sort of dress pretty much the same. There's maybe different faces, but a lot of cities are very multicultural, so it's quite often hard to pinpoint where that city might be.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
But also it strikes me whenever I see one image like that by Streuly, I always think of Monet and the Impressionists and painting modern life. But just when you were saying that everything, they all pretty much dress the same. I mean, there is no disputing a 19th century image by Monet that it's European.
Very specific.
And this is the great difference, is it, with this sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting relationship to that sort of modern experience as well. And obviously, the city is a modern, modern form, modern legacy as well. I mean, I think with Streuly, what's interesting too, because he takes street photography where the models don't know they're being photographed, so there's this sense of the unposed subject. They're completely unaware of being photographed, and they're often in this very internal kind of space. You sort of see them in a public space of a street, but they're clearly in their own world as well. So there's that very nice play between private and public, which I think a lot of artists thinking about ideas of urban space are working with. For example, this series of photographs by Hu Yang, which are called Shanghai Living. So it's a series of photographs of domestic interiors in Shanghai, and ranging from very basic, conditions to very luxurious apartments, and just looking at basically this archive, in a sense, of how people live in this city, which is growing and changing so quickly. So it's this idea again of the private space within this much more public kind of framework.
Now, with that, I was looking at that, and with your work in the Asia-Pacific region, Nick's already spoken about the international perspective on Century 21. What about the Asia-Pacific one? I mean, from your particular set of interests, how do you see, I suppose, the place of Asia-Pacific in the new globalised kind of world, and maybe what sort of cultural impact is it having from what you've studied over there?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think Asian art in particular has, in a sense, defined the global. It's been I suppose the one, I mean, maybe Latin America to a lesser extent, but it's been the one region, I guess, that has really made an impact internationally in the last 10 to 20 years, and I suppose expanded it beyond Europe and America, particularly China And I think that has, the New Art Centre of Beijing is probably the first big New Art Centre outside of Europe and America for a very long time. So I think that has shifted the dynamics, and certainly that shift in power reflects obviously a much broader social and economic shift. And I think one of the big changes since the 90s has been this idea of the Biennale and that global exhibition, which the Asia Pacific Triennial, of course, was one of very much a part of, and an early one in the region. I mean, most biennales over the last 10 years or so have cropped up in Asia, and I think they've really been a very important driver of art being seen in a much more global sense as a platform for showing contemporary art from Asia and circulating it in that way. I mean, they're often international exhibitions. They bring people from all over the world to a city and to look at, they're often the curators are brought in from elsewhere. And often in places where the art infrastructure isn't necessarily that developed, so you don't have big art museums with big collections necessarily, but you do have a biennale, so that's where the work is seen.
So, I mean, economically, clearly Japan was the great post-war economic miracle, and then Singapore, and then you had that Asian tiger scenario. Obviously China has continued to make it the Asian, or it's looking like the Asian centre increasingly.
Yeah.
And is then, that linked to what you're saying about the growth of biennales and stuff like that, is that financial, is there financial investment from China and other governments in Asia that really is giving that culture a push along, or has an artist been integrated more powerfully into the global circuit of things? How would you describe it?
I think outside of Asia, I think it's still, I mean, it's got a market dimension, I think. Chinese art reaches huge prices in New York or London, and Indian art, and obviously Japanese art for a longer period of time. But it's still, aside from a few key artists, I think it's still seen very much as it's really shown within the context of a biennale, like an international show, or with a regionally based show, a show about Chinese art or Indian art or so on. So it hasn't necessarily broken out much more broadly. I think it's still some way to go. But it's changed. I mean, the change has been enormous, I think.
Yeah, and when
Yeah.
you say that, as I was just thinking, you said that last thing, the change has been enormous, and still so much more potential. It'll be really interesting.
Yeah. So that's shifting all the time, and I think within several years things have flipped, quite dramatically. So I think in another few years, something else we might not have expected will have appeared. It's that dynamic, I think. Yeah.
Now, getting back to you, Nicholas, when you were talking about getting the ideas together for the shows and the sort of art that was being produced, you kept on saying the art gallery all the time. And when you were saying it, it made me realise that really the changing nature of the art gallery, which, I could say is becoming more like an experience centre in some ways. In relation to that, how much has the art museum changed in the way in which it deals with audiences? Because, that's what struck me about what you're saying. It's not just the new art and the new ideas that are coming up in art and the themes that are being treated. The gallery itself is undergoing, as you were saying, the physical and, I suppose, cultural infrastructures have undergone dramatic change as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the way I think about it is often in terms of, I guess we might say, different levels of, where are these images? Different levels of encounters, if you like, that a museum makes possible today. So whereas in the past there might have been, one type of encounter that you would expect to have as a visitor to a museum, which might be between a relatively static object or image on the wall and then, a single kind of body in the space. But I think while that, more traditional mode still exists today, and there's, we can still find lots and lots of examples of that kind of encounter, that kind of relationship between an artwork and and a visitor in this show, that there's all these other sort of ranges of possibilities as well now that might be about an artist constructing a situation which is about an encounter between two visitors or between an artist and the visitor. And I think that one of the ways that artists have tried to do that is almost by looking at models from outside the art world. So one might be looking at the model of the theatre as an example. So there's this sense of, creating a stage within the gallery. So there's this kind of performative kind of situation unfolding in the gallery. I mean, this is an example here that sort of ends up having that kind of character, which is a piece by Thai artist Rikrit Tiravanesia, where visitors are invited to come and have lunch in the gallery. So there's this kind of performative element. The audience members are sort of invited, as it were, to perform in this situation set up by the artist. Another might be the model of the artist studio. And I think we see that more and more of like artists creating these environments in galleries that are approximating what they have in their studio, and maybe the Olafur Eliasson is a good example of that. So, so this is obviously a piece that starts at its life as this enormous mountain of white Lego. I think we have 900 kilos in total sitting on the table. And then over the course of the exhibition, visitors are coming and, constructing and deconstructing and rebuilding the city space, these cityscapes. And I mean, I think even the kind of format of this work, of this kind of, this long table and the workbenches are very much kind of evoking, that image of the artist studio, and this kind of like, this thing of like testing out ideas in a way, which is, what artists are doing in their studio.
That's a fascinating, I've not had the insight into his work before, but that's a fascinating idea that rather than the artist being somewhat removed from the audience, which is the traditional kind of idea the artist has, his or her genius or their expertise, that what you were just saying, it's really the idea that the artist is almost saying, this is the way I make, and I'll produce a work of art so that you can sort of know how it is to make. And I think that's a really inclusive kind of thing to do, and to share the kind of artist experience rather than remain in distance.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think that the way that these participatory works operate, I think they operate in quite different ways. So the Olafur Eliasson one is very much a situation where, we're invited to come into this space and act upon the work. So we're kind of asked to create the work, kind of according to a framework that the artist might set up. Where there are other works, other sort of participatory works in the show, however, that operate kind of in the reverse way. So rather than the audience being invited to act upon the work instead acts upon us. So the work changes us rather than us changing the work. And kind of returning to that idea about borrowing, these kind of formats from other disciplines. I mean, I think Carsten Höller is interesting in that respect too. Actually comes from a background as a biologist, and there's this sense in his practice of kind of using the model of the laboratory, so kind of transforming the gallery into a laboratory, and the artwork becomes almost like an experiment. So we become sort of experimented upon by experiencing the work. And his work is very much about trying to, elicit a very particular, kind of brain chemistry or emotional state in the viewer. So there's this sense of the work kind of changing us, by having this experience of sliding.
Yes, he actually says experience is his content, doesn't he,
Yeah.
in his work?
Something like Rikrit too. I mean, he's taking, Thai curry as something that we associate with a cultural product. I think something we, our knowledge of Thailand is often through Thai food, but creating an experience around that. So those sorts of projects he's been doing since the early 90s, and were initially inspired by a couple of things. One was just as a student, people would come together. He studied in New York, and he'd just make curry for his friends, and it became this regular activity that was almost like a performance, and it was really just shifting it into a gallery in a sense from something that he would do anyway. But the other aspect of it was he was interested in how Asian objects were presented in American museums. Something like a Buddha statue, for example, would be shown completely decontextualized. This is an object that is used in its original context in a temple or someone's home, but in a museum it becomes completely removed from that, just becomes this aesthetic piece. So he started to think about what is lost and try and invest it back into the art object. So he's very interested in what happens around the object, and this idea of use becomes very important, how we use art. So we tried to create, I suppose, functional pieces that people could use in a very practical kind of way as well, but throw the emphasis back onto the audience.
Yes, and also seems if you have a statue of Buddha or something that's 300 years old, you know, it's an inert
Mm.
kind of, for want of a better word, dead object, which is then shown, as you said, in a different context. But with something like the curry, it's a living
Mm.
exchange of culture, isn't
Yeah.
it? Sharing that
Yeah,
culture.
that's right. And it's interesting seeing that in relation to the masks, perhaps, on the other wall, which are also objects of use originally, but were also taken out of their context as aesthetic objects. And there was a big exhibition in the 80s that was trying to relate, or two big exhibitions that were trying to relate particularly African art to Western art, and the often they were objects of use, you know, like masks, or there was a Aboriginal sand drawing, for example, or coffins from Ghana, these beautiful sculptural coffins, but really presented simply as art objects and not without a context, without even an author. So they become anonymous things. Yeah.
And also, just getting back to what Nicholas is saying, I want to ask you again, Russell. I'm sorry, I'm not used to using the mic, excuse me. Just in relation to what Nicholas is saying, just previous to what you were saying about Indonesia, but the idea that you know, there's experience, it's not just an object on the wall anymore. It can be like a replication, a studio, it can be a laboratory, it can be all of those things. And this has been linked to this idea of the post-medium. People have spoken about the post-medium. What is your understanding of what the post-medium is, and how does it manifest itself in, you know, in a gallery like this one?
Do you want to take that one up? Or?
I'll have a go on that one. Sure. So there's, I mean, I guess the way that the post-medium was, maybe just as an introduction, so this was a term introduced by Rosalind Krauss, who was a student of, Clement Greenberg's, the kind of, American art historian of the second half of the 20th century. And, of course, Greenberg was most interested in, what you would do as an artist was you would explore the kind of key, like most fundamental aspects of whatever medium you were working in, and you try to express them in the artwork. And so Krauss, and I think she introduced the term in the 90s, wasn't it? So she, I guess, maybe put simply, she was thinking about the way that at that period artists were kind of working in between different media, making these quite sort of, I guess, hybrid forms that were sort of not invested in any one particular discipline, if you like. So and I think there's a range of different artists that explore that idea in the show, and I mean maybe one that I could just, briefly point out in this image. It's actually kind of hard to make out, but it's this, it's the Mick video. So there's perfect, that's the one. So which is, Mick's a Dutch video artist, and he was quite interesting. He's been working since the early 1990s, but he was one of these people who was kind of, I guess, one of the earlier video artists to start working with video in a way that it was, very much included in the same space as our bodies, as visitors, and as sculpture, and as paintings on the wall. So, I guess another way to put that is he was, I guess, trying to create a different kind of experience. So unlike that, common experience we have when we go into an art museum and we see a video, we go into this, totally black box that's kind of like this experience here in a cinema. So it's completely dark, and we just focus our attention entirely on the projected image, and so we give ourselves over to what's happening on screen. We kind of lose ourselves in this, fictional projected space, and forget about our bodies and anyone else sitting in the room with us. So Mick's work was trying to resist that kind of mode, if you like, of presenting videos. So he started to work with videos in a way that actually became quite sculptural on the one hand, and I guess in another way was very much kind of borrowing from kind of strategies of installation art. So his videos, they're always rear projected, that they're always, as you can see, the bottom of the image actually hits the ground as if it's, affected by gravity in the same way that we are. So there's this idea of it, being in the same, kind of phenomenal space that we are as visitors. And it very much did that by, kind of bringing these other disciplines into video, so that video was not just this, projected image. It wasn't just this, fictional space on a screen, but it became something that had volume and it had presence, like a physical presence in the space.
Because that was the thing with Greenberg, wasn't it, in the 1950s kind of painting. You only did painting. If you put a block of wood on a painting, it would be thrown out of town, right? And it's interesting saying about cinema because, in the painting for Greenberg, you had to become completely absorbed in this thing called, this universe called the painting. You were saying exactly the same about, the cinematic experience too kind of resembles that kind of self-absorption. But also I thought about the conceptual dimensions. I mean, that's the other argument, isn't it? That strong conceptually driven work that does not depend so much on
absolutely.
Yeah. So it's not the necessarily just the material qualities of the medium, but it's what Krauss, I think, called the support structure. So it's the conceptual ideas around the medium which broadens it out significantly. If we could maybe look at, we've got a display upstairs of, we're going, whoops. Oh, that's not good, is it? Sorry. Oops. Sorry. Is the performance videos upstairs? So thinking about, again, using a very simple format of a video, but it's really about the body, and it's about the way the body. Okay. Sorry, yep. So how the body performs in space, almost like with the Sean Gladwell work. I mean, it's quite sculptural. You've got this figure that's just a central figure that you look at. It sort of turns as you might move around a figurative sculpture, but it's a performance as well. So he's, doing this skateboarding on Bondi Beach on a rainy day. You have other images of Campbell Patterson, lifting his mother. So again, it's a performance, but it's using the form of video to capture that.
And Gladwell's kind of self-portrait too.
Yeah, so there's, and the scale of it on a wall again is like a painting. So, there's all these different things we can read into it. It's not simply, as Nick said, just about the projected world. Similarly with Choi Kwon-yu, who's also, in a sense, I mean, this relates to what we were talking before about urban space. So in here, he's doing these actions in the city, these very silly kind of little things that are using different elements of the urban space in a way that wouldn't normally be used. So it's like creating your own private world, in a sense, within public space, which is something a number of artists do.
And I mean, I think another thing was interesting about all these videos. This was something that we noticed when we were putting the show together, that there were all of these kind of single channel videos, many of which were already in the collection, that had very kind of particular quality that they seemed to share, which was, was normally the artist, him or herself, performing directly to the camera. So where the artist was, often the kind of filmmaker and the actor and the, editor, and also kind of, made sort of very quickly with, with the advent of kind of very cheap new digital cameras and I guess editing software, which now comes with every single computer and is kind of easy enough for anyone to be able to operate. And we thought this was sort of interesting that this was sort of happening at the beginning of the first decade, and there seemed to be some echoes with that kind of moment in the late 60s when artists were going from working in film and in 16mm film into working with video for the first time, and it created this kind of explosion of moving image works, which were also often very much about these kind of performative actions. So we sort of saw this interesting kind of echo of that moment, which I think also occurs with many other works in the exhibition, and not only relating to that moment in the 60s, but when we looked at the masks by Romuald Hazame, and there's the archway by Tobias Putri, looking at 60s architecture. There's another piece that I think we skipped over by Martin Boyce, which is a public sculpture outside the building, which is kind of, again, relating back to a moment in the 1920s, I believe it was. So there's a lot of works that are kind of, have these really interesting sort of historical dialogues or echoes contained within them.
Yes, well, look, I think that's we might end the interview now, but I wanted to thank you because contemporary art is a very complicated and diffuse kind of diverse and pluralistic kind of area, and I think that both you have helped to give some sense of coherence to contemporary artists and the works that are in the gallery modern art. So thanks so much, Ross and Nicholas, for talking to us today.
Thank you. Thanks.